where history's shadows cast long, unsettling doubts, the truth lies buried. From cryptic wartime codes to assassinations that scarred generations, unearth the secrets the world tried to forget. Hosts Tim Gardner and Virginia Picotte guide you through a labyrinth of unanswered questions, where every clue pulses with danger and intrigue, and perhaps an opinion or two. It's not all facts, because history never is. Welcome to the Ciphered Past.
I am Tim Gardner, along with my co-host Virginia Picotte, and with this particular show, we specifically talk about post-World War II and beyond of events that tie it down into the world today, and we want to thank you guys for joining us. On today's show, we have two special guests. We have Andrew Iler and Mark Adamczyk, and both are accomplished attorneys and just wonderful gentlemen that work with JFK chokeholds, and we are very pleased to have them on the show with us today. Virginia, why don't you go ahead and give a quick peek out to everybody there.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. We're delighted to have you here.
All right. Well, without further ado, we'll go ahead and jump a quick bio on it. Mr. Andrew Iler is a Canadian lawyer based in Ontario with his private focusing on corporate, commercial, and administrative law. He is a co-author of the JFK Assassination chokeholds, and he's considered to be one of the foremost, if not the expert on the JFK Assassination records. And then we have Mark Adamczyk. He's an attorney out of Naples, Florida. He's a graduate of Tulane University and Florida State University College of Law. For the past 20 years, Mark has been studying the JFK assassination and related United States history. Mark's recent focus has been the JFK Records Collection Act, the federal law that guarantees the public disclosure of the history surrounding the JFK assassination. Mark is dedicated to ensuring that the U.S. government complies with its remaining obligations under the JFK Records Collections Act. Mark is also one of a handful of lawyers in Southwest Florida who primarily focuses on community association law on a daily basis. Gentlemen, I want to thank you guys for joining us today.
Thank you for having us, Tim and Virginia.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. And so I just want to go ahead and do a quick open forum to start out exactly with where we're at right now. A lot has happened this year. I just want to get a quick question to you guys within I would say this year alone, the progress that we have seen. Is it in your minds, and I'll let you guys, whoever wants to start first, but in your minds, has this year been a year of more progress versus past years?
Andrew, do you want me to start with that, or?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, it's been an interesting year, and to really fully understand it, of course, you'd have to go back to 2017 when the deadline for the final release of all records under the JFK Act was mandated. And Trump and Biden and how they essentially kick the can down the road to today. There's a lot of history there. It would probably take a whole show to go through what happened in 2017 and what Trump was faced with and why there was only a delay. And then we've seen in 2017, 2018, and 2023, and of course 2025, more releases. The big picture, getting to the bottom line, and why we're continuing to work on this, notwithstanding what appears to be great progress this year, is there's still no full accountable catalog and index to go to at the National Archives to verify that everything that's been released this year is everything at the National Archives. And that's what is the fundamental problem. And Andrew, I'm sure we'll talk about his amazing work on the final determinations of the Assassinations Record and Review Board, the ARRB, which is a foundational collection of records which shows what the review board from 1994 to 1998, mostly in the last couple of years, 96 through 98, did its most intense work on postponement requests from agencies. Until that is in the public, so we can see what work the review board actually did and how that ties to the releases here in recent years and this year. And then until there's a full, reliable catalog and index as required by the statute for everything that is at the archives, when we see records releases now, there's no way to tie a lot of them back to what they call a record identification form or a RIF. So the big picture is we're trying to make sure that there is a full collection released to the public, and we're not satisfied that that's been done yet. And that's the best way I can put it.
Yeah, if I can jump in, Mark really does hit it on the head here. Without having a comprehensive and complete index and catalog of records that can be uniformly searched, the records collection is a bit of a mess. And that's just not me saying that. That's pretty much everyone that tries to make use of the collection at the National Archives, including many employees at the archives who acknowledge that the collection is, quote, a mess. And really what I liken this to, it's like the dance of 1,000 veils. They'll lift one veil off and you'll see some allegedly new records come out. And then in another few months, they'll lift another veil. And apparently there's now thousands of more records that have been released. And then another veil comes off. And a lot of the times, the information that's being released are the same records. And they make it look like there's a whole bunch of new records when really it's a word here or there in the same records. And so it really, without having a complete index and catalog of records, we don't know what's still withheld. We don't know what records are fully disclosed in a manner that will actually assist with the research of the assassination records at the National Archives. And the problem that they have is that the whole purpose of the JFK Records Act was to open up all of the assassination records so that the American public could have a fuller understanding of what happened on November 22nd, 1963, and in the investigations that followed.
Yeah, and I wanted to chime in about that, and that's the reason why I asked open-ended question to both you guys, is because, in my opinion, we have had, I think both task force, testimonies were, I thought they were great, with Dr. Curtis on the second one, of course, James DiEugenio and Oliver Stone in the first one. I feel like there has been a little bit of progress, but like you both mentioned, I feel like we're basically only getting to like barely anywhere just because they are holding stuff back. And Andrew, you and I talked off the air earlier this month about the Joanides files pending release, which I want to get your take on both your takes on that as well. It's interesting because I feel like, and this is just me as a researcher, I feel like we're getting just basically a sample, let's say like at Costco versus like the whole buffet that we could have access to.
Yeah, listen, I'll say this. The entire Joanides episodes and the files related to George Joanides are extremely interesting. But they really deal with the nature of the setup of Oswald and the cover-up. And they don't really tackle the primary issue of the assassination. And I don't want to be critical because I agree. I think Representative Luna has done a fantastic job
Absolutely.
bringing attention to the assassination. She's made some bold statements, and she's had a fantastic array of witnesses before 2 hearings. These are the first hearings we've had in a major way that have shed new light on the assassination since the late 70s. And I think a huge amount of credit should be placed on Representative Luna and some of her colleagues on the task force. So I'm not being critical here of that, but what I am being critical of is that they've taken a very, very small slice of one small aspect of the problems with the records, that being the George Joanides files. And it's kind of been at the expense of the overall handling of the records collection itself, the transfer of records from the agencies to the National Archives, the cataloging of those records, and understanding how the standards of the JFK Records Act were either applied to some of the records or not applied to some of the records. And I know Mark, both Mark and I over the last couple of months have shifted our focus a little bit to better understanding how agencies may have circumvented the review of the Assassination Records Review Board by transferring records both before the passage of the JFK Records Act and transferring records subsequent to the termination of the ARRB's period of operations, which ended in September of 1998. And what we're finding is a lot of evidence that would suggest that records were transferred to the National Archives, particularly by the CIA, after the ARRB's operations terminated in 1998. And that would mean that a whole bunch of records that we're now seeing released were never reviewed under the standards of the Act by the Assassination Records Review Board, either because agencies just miraculously found a whole bunch of records once the ARB went out of operations, or they withheld those records from ARRB review by waiting out the term of the ARB. And Mark, maybe you want to talk about Judge Tunheim's testimony before the May 20th hearing in Washington, because this has gotten a little bit kind of brushed under the carpet from major coverage, but Judge Tunheim made some massive statements during his testimony, and this is a guy who's very carefully spoken and quite moderate in how he lays things out. Mark, I don't know whether you want to follow that up.
Yeah, I'd love to, because there was like Tim and Andrew, you said, there was wonderful witnesses at the both April 1st and May 20th hearing, but only 2 witnesses really talked about the status of the records. Jim DiEugenio touched on it on April 1st, and then thankfully, they had Judge Thunheim, the chair of the review board, testify on May 20th. And I know Andrew and I, sitting here today, can say when we heard Judge Thunheim the first time, it made a lot of sense. Nothing was a shock. But if you went back and listened to it, and both Andrew and I have listened to it a couple times since, there's a lot of important information that he got out there in a very calculated way. So he was sharing his experience as the chair of the review board trying to declassify millions of records. The chief function of the review board was to handle declassification decisions of postponement requests from agencies, the records that they did not want to be declassified and released, and where they had what they believed sensitive information that needed to be postponed. So the review board's job as an independent agency was to hear the agency's evidence as to why a record should be postponed and for how long, and they made a final decision. So that was a painstaking process, as both Jim and Judge Thunheim testified to, but Judge Thunheim went a step further and essentially said, look, it didn't take a rocket scientist to figure they were waiting us out. They took a full day to tie up the review board's time over a single record or two. I mean, the Lopez report on Mexico City, oh my gosh, I think they took hours and hours to get through a single page of the Lopez report, which eventually got declassified. But they were extremely difficult, and I saw a record of this week, in fact, going back and looking at records that might be relevant to what Judge Thunheim said. They were most difficult when the review board asked for a specific record to complete its mandate to search and complete the collection. They either wouldn't get back to them, or they'd say, we'll look into it, right? The biggest, I think, takeaway I have is when he said, look, the recent releases, he was talking about the 2025 releases, the review board never saw many of them, and that these records were transferred to NARA, to the National Archives, at a later time, meaning after the ARRB closed business in September of 1998. That's a violation of the JFK Act, and it raises a lot of other questions, which I included in my letter to Representative Luna. So if a lot of records were not seen by the review board and transferred to the National Archives at a later time, who reviewed them? What is the status of them? And have they been released finally? And again, it comes back to the catalog and the index. So that statement that he made, it jumped off the page to me as requiring investigation as to the activities at NARA between 1998 and present day.
One of the reasons that we wrote our letter, when I come back and tie into what you're talking about, was due to Judge Thunheim and the comments he made. He made some additional comments that I thought were interesting. He spoke about the recommendations, and it seemed as though he was talking about recommendations he had made to her privately before coming into the hearing. But he reiterated the importance of following them, and it seemed as though those were operational and effectiveness focused. Additionally, he mentioned the Angleton records, and that, they didn't say they were missing, but they were unavailable, I think was the word. I could be mistaken. So from our perspective, and I'm speaking on Tim's behalf as well as mine, as U.S. citizens, one of the reasons that we engaged and wrote our letter is that we were concerned about what he was talking about. And, in addition to things that you've just covered, Mark. And so we felt as though the records are key, and particularly with the noise around, okay, well, you're getting records, but I hate to use this term, but I will, so what? There's nothing in them, which we know is not true. But we also don't know what the scope of the records is, as you've just talked about. We don't have that information. And we felt as though we could not stop, the momentum in any way. And our concern has been that because of some of the other Epstein and other issues, that the JFK records might lose their momentum. And that the nuances tied to transparency and tied to effectiveness are being overlooked. So your letter, Mark, really spoke to me in particular, because of the way you really went into this detail, and you were addressing, I think, and reinforcing the judge's concerns, as you alluded to. And I am really appreciative of that, because that's where we went as well, not in as refined manner, not as legalistically, but at least from a citizen's perspective, we understood and we tried to communicate it. Now, after we sent the letter, of course, I've not received a response back. I had hoped, because we did send them to multiple individuals on the task force, as well as to the Oversight Committee Chairman, Representative James Comer, and some others. And we haven't heard back. And so I thank you for your efforts, as well as Andrew's, to bring attention to these things, because most citizens might not really understand how important this level of detail is, but it is. We don't know if there's a smoking gun or not if we don't have all the records.
Yeah, that's well said. I'm glad you sent a follow-up letter recognizing the importance of the things that Judge Thunheim said, because that gets to the heart of the issue for sure.
I think there's two things that we're all kind of focusing on here, and there's kind of two tracks that I see happening. They're both functional in a different way. So a lot of people are more interested, obviously, on individual records and the information within those records. But I think there's a danger in focusing just on specific records at the expense of looking at how the agencies and the National Archives have maintained and added to the collection, and how they've gone about releasing records as a whole rather than individual records. And I think that's when you focus on that bigger picture, how did they handle or mishandle the release of the records, and whether they've actually complied with the JFK Records Act. That's actually the more important question right now, because if you can deal with that, if you can deal with there not being a proper, full and complete index of records, once you have that in hand, then all the individual records and the information in those records will be much easier to properly track by the research community. And so I think this focus on individual records is a little bit of a potential distraction. I'm not saying the information's not important, but it creates a problem. It's almost like a diversion that's happening from the bigger problem. We don't know exactly what's in the records collection. We don't know the status of how the records are being dealt with. And without that knowledge, it's like hit and miss. We're shooting in the dark, trying to look for things.
Yes, I definitely agree with you on that. And, I think that all of the focus that we've had recently on Joe Anides has been wonderful. And I congratulate Luna as well as Morley for the excellent work that they've done in being able to get that file that she's worked with CIA, was able to capture that. There's just so much more, and that's really where we were coming from, was a holistic perspective, with the understanding that the attention really is in the detail of the issues in obtaining the records, the obstruction, even to the level of FOIA. I mean, when the problems with FOIA were mentioned in the JFK Records Act itself. And so I thought that was really interesting, because we've had issues with some of the governmental processes. We had the JFK Records Act that the intention was to solve it. We have had continued ongoing obfuscation for various reasons. And, we can't lose sight of the fact that we need to have transparency in the process itself that the task force is using to understand how are they going about truly trying to capture the full scope, as well as who are they consulting with, who is involved in providing counsel and guidance on some of the matters related to the records. And ultimately, we really, I think, I think all Americans would like to see this case solved, unless, of course, they already believe it was. But I think that most of us understand that there was a conspiracy and who was involved in that and why. And ultimately, that's really what we want to know at the very end of this. Tim, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, what's interesting to me, and maybe both you guys can elaborate off this, is that I'm interested with the documents that have been presented out thus far. I would just a quick question to both of you guys is that with the MLK files and with the RFK files, there have been some sprinkled in JFK documents in those particular files. Some that are pretty important. Now, when it comes to how these records are released and how they're presented to the public, to the National Archive, is it common to have the JFK files be mixed up with other records, like in other cases?
Well, it really comes back to the first thing that the JFK case is the only assassination or tragedy where there's a law behind it. And that's why I think it's super important to follow through in ensuring compliance with that law. And in the process, the oversight committees that are investigating the other matters will learn something, and they'll take the same hopefully process of making sure the JFK records collection is complete. I know that's not exactly your question, but if we don't have a complete index of all the JFK records at the national, what was received at the archives either before, during, or after the review board, then we really can't. I mean, if it's common to be included in another batch of records, why? I mean, there's no explanation of that. So my guess is as good as yours.
Yep.
Yeah, we're in touch with a lot of other researchers, and I mean, I know Joe Bax has posted on his Substack, which is really worth reading, on the JFK records. Joe has found a bunch of JFK records. Some of them have RIF numbers, some of them don't, intermingled in the MLK files, and some of the stuff that he's finding has nothing to do with the Martin Luther King assassination. It's 100% JFK assassination related records. And the fact that they have no RIF numbers suggests that they were never reviewed by the review board. And if they're just being released today, there is a lot of information in one particular record that Joe posted on, that shows the kind of detail that was being reviewed, and this is a CIA record. So I don't know what to say about it. It just shows that there maybe mistakes were made, but so many mistakes, all resulting in records not being released. It becomes hard to it becomes hard to explain just by negligence or omission.
Yeah, it's just been very, very interesting to me to see how that process actually does work out itself. But one thing I wanted to touch base with you guys about also is about Oliver Stone's role specifically with that first hearing that we had. Now, I agree with him 100% about how that this case should be reopened, and I understand that it is a very arduous process in order to get to, just to even get a little bit of records to be opened up. In your guys' opinion, with Oliver and Mr. DiEugenio's work, and of course Mark, and of course yours, Andrew, as well, collectively, do you feel like you guys are actually making enough headway when it comes to being up against the resistance of things that you guys are dealing with?
When it comes to the hearings, I think the fact that Oliver Stone was there in 1992 testifying, and really was the catalyst for the creation of the JFK Records Act and the ARRB. I really urge your listeners to go and rewatch the film JFK and carefully read that last caption that went up on the screen that really sparked the public reaction to the HSCA files not being released until 2029. That screen alone probably resulted in the passage of the JFK Records Act. But what it says also on that final screen is that the HSCA, one of its recommendations was that the Department of Justice reopen an investigation. And it said and the HSCA was in the late 70s, and JFK was released in December of 1991. And in those years, nothing happened. The Department of Justice did not reopen an investigation despite Congress urging it to. So I think Oliver Stone's testimony on April the 1st and is stating that we need a new investigation. When you combine that with the information that Doug Horne testified to on the second hearing on May 20th, with regard to the Bethesda witnesses actually seeing very similar injuries to the president's head as were identified at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. But the way the media has covered that, or failed to cover Doug Horne's testimony, those two things really strongly still, nothing's changed. There needs to be an investigation. The Bethesda witnesses and the Parkland witnesses, their testimony is consistent with there being a large exit wound in the back of the president's head. And that alone warrants a new investigation.
Yeah, well said, Andrew. I think the investigation, if we really think about it, is right here in this conversation we're having today is the records, because while witnesses have long expired, the records live on, in perpetuity. And so to fully investigate the status of the records, make sure that everything that was accumulated by a government agency or office as of 1992 and the Records Act was passed. I mean, at that point in time, you had the HSCA investigation records, the other congressional committees, living witnesses who did testify to the HSCA on Mexico City, Oswald, what have you. Those records are there. They're out there. And that investigation in a bubble will allow for a more definitive account on what happened to the president. So I think Oliver Stone would 100% be behind that. His movie is the legacy that led to the Records Act and why we're still talking about this in 2025.
Absolutely.
And so that's the investigation that I'd like to see that could be most impactful, knowing that witnesses aren't here to conduct a trial on the case per se, but Andrew makes a lot of good points about the testimony of Doug Horne on May 20th and the autopsy and the photographs. I mean, all those things could be investigated and on top of that, Dan Hardway gave a very clear testimony about Oswald being used operationally in Mexico City. There are more records without question out there on that, in addition to the Lopez report, and until proven otherwise.
His presentation was absolutely fantastic. I just have to give kudos to Doug Horne. It was just amazing. I just wanted to use that as a side note, but Virginia actually has some questions about the memo here that she wants to chime in about.
Well, I just thought it was interesting, the memo that I think, what was this gentleman's name? J. Kenneth MacDonald wrote, regarding the records and the large volume of those when they were deciding what to do about them. So I just found that curious. I hadn't actually gone in and read it before. I have now, and I thought the, boxes 1 through 34 and so on, the microfilm, all of it, it's very interesting. Do you think that there's hope for those records?
So we don't know exactly what was transferred to NARA and when. And what you're referring to is a February 10, 1992 memo that the head of the CIA's Historical Records Group was asked to write by the Director of Central Intelligence. And the important thing to do with that memo is to put it into a time frame. Oliver Stone's film was released on December 20th, 1991. And within weeks, the film, and especially what it said in that last image of the little script where he said that the HSCA records won't be released until 2029, they're being held in secret. The CIA knew that there was going to be a public backlash. They had been attacking that film for months before it was actually even released in the theaters. That film, JFK by Oliver Stone, posed a huge problem, especially to the Central Intelligence Agency. And they attacked that film relentlessly. And what happened after its release is the Director of Central Intelligence ordered the chief of the Historical Records Group to really itemize and create an index of records that were in the sequestered records file from the HSCA investigation, and come up with a strategy on how the CIA could continue to hold these records under their current classification. And Kenneth MacDonald dutifully provided a 23-page memo, and people can look it up. Virginia, maybe you have the RIF number, but it's a pretty phenomenal document because it anticipates 8 months before the passage of the JFK Records Act. And even more amazingly, it anticipates a very specific section of the JFK Records Act that ended up 8 months later becoming Section 5D3. And 5D3 essentially states that any records transferred to the National Archives before the passage of the Act would not necessarily receive RIF numbers and didn't necessarily require ARRB review. And so in that light, like not having access to the Act, Kenneth MacDonald recommended that the CIA transfer its entire sequestered collection of HSCA records to the National Archives before the passage of any yet defined piece of legislation governing the records. Now, there's another document from the CIA. It's missing several pages, but it's also dated February 10th. And someone, an unattributed author, essentially says, get the hell out. There's no way in hell that the CIA is going to transfer or allow a third party to review one damn operational file of the CIA. And that kind of shows what the mindset is. So we don't, again, without an index and without knowing exactly what and when records were transferred from the agencies to NARA, there's no way we can know which strategy was adopted by the CIA. In the end, what we have seen, especially with what Judge Tunheim said on May 20th, what we see in metadata strongly suggests that they took a third option, which was just to simply wait out the existence of the ARRB and transfer records to National Archives so that they would be held or withheld from the public for another 25 years minimum. Now it's 30 years.
One thing I'll add to really simply, really quickly, is the memo, the 92 memo describes what's in the sequestered collection. It's 64 boxes of what was considered highly sensitive information, right? Congress did not put any exception in the JFK Act for those records or any other records. It says any assassination record, and these clearly are, of any government agency or office, of any congressional investigation, including this one, was required to go to the archives and to be reviewed by the board. Okay, so really the question on this particular collection goes to Congress and the oversight committees. You drafted this law, and it's not, this record, this collection is not exempt. What was received by the National Archives and when, and what is the full status of it? That's really the question to be posed.
And I know, Mark, I think you have recently sent a follow-up letter. So let me back up. I think you originally sent one, from what I understood. You sent a letter in February of this year to offer your support and help regarding the task force and so on. Could you talk about that a little bit, and also what the outcome was, if you were contacted or how you were engaged?
A good question. Yeah, you're right. I've sent 2 letters to Representative Luna in February when it was announced that the task force was formed and she was leading it. Andrew, it was his suggestion and I agreed with it. He says, hey, you're a Floridian, you're an attorney, you have expert knowledge on the case and that I've developed for the last 7 or 8 years with, along with Andrew. And you could be of assistance. So I was like, yeah, that I would be a great idea to. The main point of that letter is like a couple pages was, hey, it's really critical to understand how the JFK Records Act is supposed to work so that, you could expedite your results here with this task force on completing the investigation into governmental secrecy, right? I got an acknowledgement of a receipt. I spoke to Luna's aide, not spoke, but she, replied a couple times saying, we have your letter. And I never heard anything further. And then, of course, you had the April 1st and May 20 hearings. After, I'd say, late June, early July, after fully digesting the testimony on May 20th and listening to Judge Thunheim's testimony again, and then at Andrew's suggestion, looking at that 1992 memo that we talked about at length a moment ago, it really occurred to me that there was a lot more to look at on the status of the records, and gave some pointed examples of areas of investigation at the National Archives, and we've touched on that at length here already. I got another email response saying we've received it and we'll pass it along, and I've heard nothing since, which is disappointing because while the witnesses to date have been incredible in sharing a lot of their experiences and focused areas in the case, like I said a moment ago, until the records collection is complete and these things are figured out, then there's not a complete job. And until the archivist can say under oath, as required by the JFK Act, that everything's out there, everything they received by law from early 1992 until today is out in full to the public, we have a lot of work to do still. So that was the point of it, and I've not heard anything further, unfortunately.
Well, and thank you for that, because, I heard you touch on that slightly in another podcast or a video, and I was appreciative because I felt kind of woe is me because I hadn't gotten a response, to the letter we sent. And then, but I know that that's not atypical necessarily. When you're writing as a citizen, you really need to sometimes have those connections or have a lobbyist or someone who can help you out. But I would have expected, with as expert as you are and Andrew is, that there would have been some follow-up. For folks who are interested, we'll have the link to the letter at the bottom of our episode when we post it, because you can go in on Kennedy's and King. And kennedysandking.com is a fabulous resource for anyone who's wanting to come up to speed. This has multiple contributors, primarily, though, the authors of American Chokeholds, which is fabulous, of which we have the 2 of you here. Jimmy, though, is another one. Dr. Mantic is also another contributor who has done a lot of work, and I would suggest to people, if you're interested, to go out there and read. He has some books, but he also has some articles out on Kennedy's and King, and he does talk a little bit more about the autopsies and goes a bit deeper, than Doug Horn was able to. So when we had sent in our letter, what we were wanting to do was also try to get some momentum going. We also, as I said, talked about transparency and effectiveness, but we additionally wanted to ask, and did ask, for witnesses to testify. Number one, CIA Director Ratcliffe, to explain his agency's behavior over the last however many, 62 years, to understand what they're going to do to be able to be sure that they're complying. We also had asked for Mary Haverstick, who's an author of a fantastic book. We'll include the link there. But she has encountered so many difficulties with FOIA requests, and that is not atypical. To be able to capture the information. If you do some research, you find a record, you might need to get more additional information, you submit a FOIA request, and sometimes they'll come back, sometimes not. She has one FOIA request that's been open for 5 years. So, and I'm not sure that that's unusual. So we had wanted her to testify to help explain that, and to try to see if there was some help to be had, to provide to the government some insight, to say, here are some ways that we think it could be helpful, because, I know it's very difficult. They are understaffed, but it's also difficult for the researchers, because I think the onus is placed on them sometimes to go out and give specific guidance about exactly where to find it, but they're not working in those records day after day. And they don't know how to provide that information. So I think that contributes somewhat to the back and forth. Additionally, we'd asked for Dr. Mantic himself to also testify, to just give a little bit more evidence. And, the reason being that there was for the folks that paid attention to Doug Horn's testimony, and the doctor that testified, that people were really excited about that, to learn more, like, okay, there is some evidence out there. Really, there is, and there's some information in the records. So we'd like to see that, because again, as a corollary, right, or a dual path, you have the records, but you also have the fact that we have a crime, the crime needs to be solved, especially a sitting president. That, to me, it still blows my mind that it hasn't happened. So one last thing is that, we had asked for Peter Janney to be called to testify, because he wrote a fantastic book about Mary's Mosaic, but he touches on Angleton's records. And we felt like, because those seem to be out in this netherworld, like some of the records are, if there are individuals that can come in and under subpoena and provide their testimony about what they know and where they might be, or where they last were identified, that could help with some of the effort. And so that was our intention. And, I'm thinking our next step will be, we're going to write a follow-up letter. And I think, you've said you followed up, and we were planning to follow up. What can we request that would help in the effort, do you think? What would you advise us to do, and what would you advise other listeners to say to the task force, in a call, in an email, in a letter?
Well, one thing, we can get to that in a second. I should have mentioned in my last answer that Andrew was asked to go to the April 1st hearing. Andrew, do you want to talk about that quickly, or?
Yeah. So very early on, I'd been in contact with the legal counsel for the House Oversight, and as well when I was down in Washington at the National Archives, actually in College Park, Maryland. But I had the opportunity to meet with Congressman Tim Burchett in his office for a pretty decent amount of time, to talk to him, mainly about the fact that there was evidence that congressional records had been withheld in the multiple postponements since October 2017. And, sections of the act clearly state that the president doesn't have the authority to withhold congressional records. The president has authority only over executive branch records, and that's most clearly expressed in Section 9D1 of the JFK Records Act. And so the fact that, since 2017, an untold number of unidentified congressional records, including the House Select Committee, Church Committee, Pike Committee, and other congressional records were being withheld under presidential authority. Well, again, the president didn't have authority over congressional records, but under a president's order, I thought Congress should act back then, that they should have started some kind of oversight to go, hey, we ordered all of our records to be released by latest of 2017. So I talked to Congressman Burchett about this and about the final determination issue that I've done a lot of research into. And so there was good interest there, and his staff person invited follow-up, and I have had some responses from Congressman Burchett's office, and I'm thankful for that. In terms of the House Oversight Committee, they specifically invited me down. I spent a fair amount of time on the phone with legal counsel for the House Oversight, explaining the issues around the lack of transparency of the ARRB final determinations, the legal implications that the ARRB final determinations brought. And it was expressed to me that there was a very high level of interest in this particular issue, and that the task force would be looking at that. And I did indeed go down to Congress to watch the first task force hearing on April the 1st, and that interest was reiterated then. But it seems that they have lost interest in that particular issue without really addressing it in a public way. And that's why I'm so thankful for Judge Tunheim making the statements that he did under oath on May 20th, because he reiterated a lot of the factors that were involved in my research and in the two articles that are posted on Jim D'Eugenio's Kennedy's and King about ARRB final determinations that are buried and ignored at the National Archives. And so I am a little bit disappointed that this issue hasn't reached the floor with the task force, but I am hopeful that there will be another hearing, at least one, and another chance. Like you, I think no task force on the assassination of JFK and the government secrecy around that assassination could call themselves even close to complete without calling representatives of the CIA and the National Archives to testify. And following Doug Horne's testimony about the Bethesda autopsy, I think it's really very clear now that something happened at the House Select Committee on Assassinations, particularly around the suppression of evidence of the Bethesda witnesses. Because if it weren't for Doug Horne and Jeremy Gunn back in the 90s, somehow miraculously interviewing under oath, deposing witnesses from Bethesda and from Parkland, that the world would not know the truth about the state of the president's injuries. And it's really just a complete shame that the mainstream media hasn't covered that particular piece of evidence.
And thank you, Andrew. That was fantastic. First of all, to know you've had the follow-up from Congress that you've had, even though some of it's disappointing. I am very encouraged to hear that, and I will just say, Tim Burchett, he is he's just quite engaging, and he seems very compelling. And plus, he has a couple donkeys that he puts on his, X posts, which I find endearing. But that's kind of neither here nor there. But I think it tends to show his charm, and that he will engage with people, and he is interesting, and he is curious. When we think about the archivist testifying, I agree with you. I think that's definitely needed. And separately, but on the same topic, you were talking about, why did this not get at least a little bit more attention from the public as far as the autopsies and other, and related with Doug Horn and so on. What I would say that intrigued me is that on X recently, there was some dialogue around that. And a well-known single lone gunman advocate came on and was trying to shut it down. And that's what I see a lot, in these social media, not just on that platform, but on other platforms, that there is a small but mighty and determined group of people that want to insist that there's nothing else to look at here, case closed, solved, move on. And that's obviously not the case. There was suppression of evidence, not only, at the HSCA, but also in other forums, and we can't overlook it. If we continue to overlook this as a country, what does that say about our country? And that, I think, contributes. My opinion, I'm going to get on a soapbox, but my opinion is that the murder of a sitting president and all of this last 62 years of obfuscations and effort being made, but then not wholly, and so on, has created or helped contribute to this societal mores that we have a little bit. And I would like to see it overcome. I do believe if there could be sincere effort and a full accounting of the records, as well as litigation around the crime, with understanding that people who are involved most likely are no longer here, but the fact that, or even just a hearing to be able to act the same. And if that's not good enough, then perhaps, and can't get done, then perhaps Oliver Stone could be convinced to film one more attempt at doing something like that. I know Bugliosi made a mock trial effort in 1986, but we might have to go to that length from an entertainment perspective to try to get closure once we do have final records. But I think it's very important, and I really appreciate your contribution to this. And, we also look as being representatives of the people that we talk with daily on social media and that will be listening to this, to know, how they can help pursue. And there's a group of people that are still very adamant and wanting to make sure that this is solved. And so anytime you have insight, let us know, or continue to do your good work with your posts and your articles and books, and just keeping us in mind too, that there's a massive amount of the population, a large percentage, that wants to see justice done for the president.
And if I could, Virginia, I just want to follow up. I am very pleased and positive about a lot of the information that's come out of the task force. I don't want to leave my last statement on what seems like a negative note. I'm very pleased that the task force has engaged, a number of the witnesses and looked at the information that I've provided. I do think that there's a legal basis for what I've raised with the final determinations. Mark and I have worked for years on this, really taking deep dives into the law, and so I don't want to come across at all negative. I don't want to go too deep into this, but I do think that there has been some unnecessary gatekeeping in terms of certain elements of the research community, and particularly on the legal side. And so I do hope that that the task force does look at the merits of the law that's being presented and the arguments that have been presented, and aren't simply taking the recommendations and advice of the people that do have the ear of Representative Luna. I think there's a wider, competent, reliable research community out there, and my worry is that if there's a singular focal point from the research community that has an overly powerful amount of influence on the task force, that they may be missing out on other really, really profoundly important areas of the assassination. I don't really want to get too deep into that, but I think it's important to say.
Understood, and I thank you, and I appreciate that, and I agree. I was just thinking yesterday, I wouldn't have imagined this time last year that we would even be having this discussion. And because we had President Trump's executive order, and because, Representative Luna was selected, and because she is doggedly determined, we have made progress. I say we collectively, as America, or the United States. But anyway, so yes, we owe her our thanks and gratitude for what she's done, as well as for the individuals who witnessed, and Jefferson Morley, because I was really pleased when he had some victory in obtaining that file, because he sure fought hard. I mean, the man sued the CIA. So, I was really pleased about that. So I didn't want to leave it either, that I was not understanding that this is extraordinary what has happened this year. I really believe that. So I just hope that we can keep the momentum going and having more extraordinary events occur out of this. So, Tim, would you like to take it?
I'd actually like to hear Mark's thoughts on that real quick, because I think I really like what you just said, Virginia. And Mark, did you have anything you wanted to respond to that about?
Yeah, I was just thinking, as we're closing this incredible discussion, I want to echo that the 100%. I mean, there's been on the progress. I mean, who would have thought in 2025 that we'd be having a new congressional effort on this, and there's opportunities, and so Virginia, you asked a few minutes ago, what would we tell listeners and as follow-ups and citizens who want to see a complete record of what happened, is a letter to their constituents, however it might be, but that's the best way to go. And the basic question is, how do I know, as a U.S. citizen or a citizen anywhere in the world, and how do I know and verify that everything, and I'm speaking to the National Archives here and the oversight committees, that everything that's the agencies and offices transferred over to the archives since 1992, how do I verify that that's everything? Is there anything left that still needs to be reviewed and fully disclosed? Because that goes back to the first discussion we had at the beginning. Yes, releases have come out, massive releases this year. Is that everything? How do I know and verify that? And I think that's a great question to ask.
And I think you're spot on. And how is it verified? And can they get somebody to sign a written statement or testify about it and give their word, that it was achieved? Because I'm all for that. Because
it's a question based in trust and what's being released from the National Archives. The question back to them is, how do I know that this is everything that you've collected since 1992 when this law was passed? If the record existed before 92, of course, almost all of them were originated before then. Was it transferred over, and has everything now been fully released? And is this everything, or is there more work to be done? That's a great question to ask, and it's pretty simple.
I agree. And so for those of us who are going to be writing, emailing, or calling, we could ask our representatives to make sure that question is asked of the appropriate parties and that an answer is obtained, and it's a credible one that can be trusted. because I think that's been part of what's driving, just what we've touched on, the lack of trust, the loss of innocence, the faith in government, and it's just snowballed, right? And so if the government itself can start rebuilding trust, step by step, opportunity by opportunity, and delivering on it, that eventually will make positive change. I believe that, and they have to be transparent, because how do they overcome all the obfuscation, the dark corners, the not knowing the total number? We don't have, an index and so on. How do they overcome it? They shine a light on it, and they let us know what their processes are, and they let us know if they've exhausted everything. And I think the American public, the worldwide public that's concerned about these things, also recognize that there are some probably extremely confidential and very sensitive records that absolutely can't be ever, shared. But there shouldn't be that many. And then we also have some of the records that are in personal or family member or, private individuals' hands. And that's a whole separate topic that I think will require some extra sensitivity and handling to make sure that those records are disclosed too. So with that, Tim, do you have any final questions that you would like to ask?
Yeah, I want to, before we go ahead and close the show, and actually with the final comments, Mark and Andrew, do you want to go ahead and give a quick plug on your socials, please?
Yeah, sure. We have a website, jfkchokeholds.com. A lot of information is up on that website, including links to most of our media appearances and some pretty critical documents. We also post regularly on our X or Twitter account, which is at JFK Chokeholds, and that's pretty up to date. And we have a pretty good following, and we release a lot of new information about the state of the records, and as well as all of the other authors' work that's out there, either on YouTube, podcasts, on Jim Diogenio's website, Kennedy's and King. It is an absolutely amazing resource for people interested in the assassination, and I highly recommend people go there. Hopefully you can put some of the links up to the two main articles that I've written on the ARRB final determinations, and Mark's letter to Representative Luna is an absolute must-read on Kennedy's and King.
No, that's exactly what I would have said. The X account, formerly Twitter, for JFK Chokeholds, there's regular posts on that on these developments, and I can encourage your listeners to follow that, because I don't know, Andrew, you correct me if I'm wrong. It's almost daily. There's something that we're putting up for more ideas and suggestions to follow.
Absolutely, and it's a wonderful follow. I mean, every day there's something new that they have out there, and it's just amazing. I want to give you kudos, gentlemen, to that, and especially also Kennedy's and King. Just great information. One last point I'd like to talk to Mark about real quick, and we've been talking about the letter that we've been working with. I think it's for my interest, and I'm sure some of our listeners as well. Your request, I mean, what would you like to see for the next task force hearing? I mean, like, who would you like to see up there? What would you like to see specifically for, like, what would your ideal scenario be for the next one, if and when we have one?
Well, there's I listed 5 recommendations in the letter, and they all circled around the things that we've been talking about, the oversight and finishing the job, because you could get into more records on Mexico City. You could get into specific things, the HSCA collection that I used as a prime example in the letter. But really, like Andrew said, stopping at a specific batch of records or topic is not doing justice full justice to the spirit and intent of the statute that Congress overwhelmingly, unanimously passed in 1992. They said everything should get out there, declassified in a meticulous process, and that's really the focus I'd like to see, because with a complete record, then I think the task force can say they did the job. Despite the tremendous progress so far, that would be the last thing. I think they could close the book on their work, and then oversight committees can move it forward, because there's work to do. That's what I'd like to see happen.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you. And I think you recapped very well and eloquently, and I appreciate it. I know Tim does too. I would also say I wanted to make sure before we close this that the Enduring Secrets episode, I started talking about at the beginning, and I wanted to close with this because it is powerful. I think it's the best I've seen. And
really
I've seen both of you together. I've seen you separately, and you've done killer jobs. There was something a bit different about this today, and tying that with the what did Jeff call it? Was it the preamble? I felt it was a tutorial for all of the records and everything. He did a great job with it. So I think listening to his episode where he's giving a good summary of the record situation, and then this Enduring Secrets episode that was published 8/24/2025. It's on YouTube for one platform. It was amazing. And so I can't thank you enough. The passion came through. Having Jimmy there helped. And, he is just, a national treasure when you think about it, for what he's done and how he's worked with Oliver Stone, and Oliver himself is. And hey, a shout out to Oliver Stone, because without that man, we all wouldn't be here having this discussion. So I thank you. And with that, if you have nothing else that you would like to cover, Tim, I think we can close out.
Yeah, I would definitely like to do that. And by the way, just for our listeners that are out there, because Andrew made a really good point on one of the past shows. He talked about Joe Rogan having somebody on, that talked about the Kennedy assassination and how the numbers went up on that. And it just the interest of the Kennedy assassination itself is there. It's valid. My interactions daily with people on X is absolutely amazing. And so we just want to keep pushing this out there to everybody, and people and people like Andrew and people like Mark. I mean, they are really, really leading the way for us. And I just want to thank you both so much.
It's been a pleasure, guys. And
Yeah,
congratulations on your new show. And I do have to say, you're very generous in complimenting Jeff Crudell and JFK, The Enduring Secret. It is an amazing show, and I hope you guys continue with good content on your show as time goes by. It's been a real pleasure for me.
Well, thank you. We appreciate
Yeah.
that. We want you to come back.
Yeah, no, we will. Invite us back anytime. I think your show is going to be great. Very focused efforts, and I think you're on the right track. So congratulations, and thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you both so much. And again, the truth is out there. We hope you have a good one, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you, guys.